Hello and welcome to Digital Marketing Musings, hosted by Merkle. Each episode, we choose a different expert to share the latest and greatest in digital marketing trends.
Today, we're interviewing Andrew Stark and Nick Iyengar about the upcoming transitions to GA4. All right, let's get to it. I'm Gaia Reed.
And I'm Andrew McCartney.
And this is Digital Marketing Musings.
Welcome back to Digital Marketing Musings Season 2. Today, we're joined by Nick and Andrew to talk about the GA4 transition.
Nick Iyengar is a 15-plus year veteran of the digital analytics industry and VP of analytics at Merkle/Cardinal Path, a Merkle company, where he manages the Google Analytics line of business. Andrew Stark is a manager within Merkle's technology strategy team. He focuses on answering and solving technology and data problems for many of our clients. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you
for having us.
Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. So today we are talking about the Google Analytics transition to GA4, a GA instance which was released in October of 2020. And there's an upcoming forced migration timeline by Google for ongoing data collection of July 1st of next year, 2023. So why is this transitioning happening? And can you guys provide any background for this?
Yeah, I can probably start us off. I think there's a lot of reasons why the GA4 transition is happening and happening now, but I'd give sort of two big macro trends that are important to think about. The first is I think people tend to forget that like Google Analytics has actually been around for kind of a sneaky long time. And obviously it's gone through a lot of iterations and that kind of thing, but Google Analytics is like 15 plus years old. And even the current version or sort of the what soon to be legacy version of Google Analytics has been around for like a full decade. And so the way that product was built for a world where people used a full-fledged laptop or desktop computer to browse websites alone. And that was kind of like the only touch point that the consumer would have with the brand. And so obviously like digital experiences have changed a lot, right? We've gone from being like highly web focused to web, app, connected devices, Internet of Things, all kinds of different ways that consumers can interact with brands. And we need a measurement platform that can sort of treat all of those equally, right? As opposed to being sort of web-centric with sort of this legacy baggage. The other big thing I'd point to is slightly more recent development is just the rise of like the privacy-aware consumer and then some of the knock-on effects that come from that, right? Like legislatures and regulatory bodies creating this sort of patchwork quilt of privacy regulation that's now being built out around the world. And so, one of the reasons for GA4 to come to the forefront now is it has a lot of net new privacy controls that it puts in the hands of marketers so that they can do the data collection and data activation that they want, but do it in a way that's as privacy safe as possible in a world where, what privacy safe even means is kind of changing from week to week and country by country. So yeah, this move to sort of the multi-platform world as opposed to web only and the rise of the need for greater privacy controls are the two big macro trends. Andrew, I'm sure there's more to add. Anything else you want to call out?
Yeah, I would just double down on the regulatory concerns. I think even today I was reading articles around potentially Italy banning Google Analytics actually. So continues to change, right? And that continued evolution of the regulatory landscape and ultimately how measurement and attribution, all the things that Google Analytics does for us, how that needs to fit into that ever-changing landscape. So a lot of the things that are changing within the platform are changing from sort of the legacy to this new GA4 paradigm has to deal with how things are calculated and making sure we're doing that in a compliant way or in a way in which it is congruent with the expectations ultimately of the users and the individuals browsing these different web properties or app properties or mobile web properties.
That makes a lot of sense.
So interesting. I am wondering, how do marketers actually make this transition? And specifically, like what best practices should they be following? Or are there pitfalls or things for them to look out for? Like, this doesn't seem like a small sort of ask to upgrade your analytics platform. So I am curious about that.
Yeah, it's not a trivial undertaking, especially for let's say, a global enterprise that potentially runs like multiple websites, multiple mobile apps, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it is an undertaking to do that kind of lift and shift, right, from, call it GA3, right, the previous generation, over to GA4. And I think, one of the things
Right.
that's served a lot of our clients well is just to like give yourself enough runway to get it done, right? So even if you don't actually plan to use GA4 day to day for some of your kind of key use cases starting tomorrow, you should still get ahead of the sort of implementation and deployment process so that you're not frantically trying to do it when Google pulls the plug, frankly, on the legacy product, right? And so it's not just that you want to beat the deadline, but you also want to beat the deadline with plenty of time to spare so that you're building up historical data, so that you're like ironing out little issues that can happen when you redeploy an analytics platform and all that. So, it's a big high level point, but I'd say one that applies like regardless of what industry you're in or what your use cases are for GA4 is start earlier than you think that you need to, and then you'll enjoy the benefits of that over the next 12 months as we kind of sunset on GA3 and start using GA4 more and more kind of in parity with the previous product. Andrew, what about you? Anything else you want to call out?
Yeah, getting ahead of it is certainly the first thing I would suggest. I think you touched on a really important point there, Nick. Building up that historical data, building up that sort of muscle, when it comes to the day-to-day operations of the new platform is really critical. You don't want to be stuck in a place where you're in a production mode and you have a bug and you're not sure how to resolve that, and it's the only analytics suite that you have available on your property. So really making sure that you have that long runway, really making sure you're building up that historical data so you can find new ways of using the data that's ultimately available out of the platform.
One other consideration that I think really is sort of universal is, a lot of our clients who are transitioning to GA4, they come in with this expectation that like what they want is basically just to create a shot-for-shot remake of what they had in GA3 and just drop it into GA4 land. And I think that that's a totally reasonable like starting point in terms of a needs assessment, right? Hey, we had this in GA3, we like it, let's make sure that we keep it. But there are a lot of aspects to GA4 that mean that you should maybe take a step back and say, like, what have our historical pain points with analytics been in general? What are we maybe not taking advantage of that we'd like to do better with? And in a lot of cases, GA4 is going to offer some net new capabilities to help you address those pain points or help you kind of mature in your practice area beyond what you could have done in the past. And so if you kind of limit yourself to only recreating what you've already had, certainly that's good in one sense. You'll make sure you're not missing anything from the past, but you'll also kind of have those blinders on and not be able to kind of fully take advantage of the new platform.
Two common questions I'm assuming we're getting from a lot of questions or from a lot of clients are, you both mentioned the need to build up historical data. Can you port over data from GA3 into your GA4 instance? And then the second question I'm guessing is, when you fully switch over, is it easy to kind of like go back and look at the data in GA3, or is it just like you flip the switch and it's all or nothing?
Yeah, in terms of how you port the data, I guess the short answer would be no. You can't just like take your GA3 data and drop it into GA4. But having said that, there are things that you can do sort of behind the scenes or in other tools to facilitate that kind of portability. So for example, a lot of our clients are going to export data they have from Google Analytics 3 into a tool like Google's BigQuery, which is quite easy to do. There's some native integrations there that make that possible. And then similarly, you could be pushing your data from GA4 into BigQuery. And so while you'll never have one Google Analytics instance that's got kind of your old data, quote unquote, and your new data, you can unify that elsewhere, for example, in BigQuery.
Got it. Awesome. So for clients who we have seen make this transition to GA4, are there any notable changes that we would want to set expectations around? Unexpected changes, or particularly good or bad ones that you want to call out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of elephant in the room, if we're being honest, is that there is still a lot of active development happening on GA4, and so I think clients are realizing that more and more, and organizations that are kind of mapping out what they want to do with GA4 are now increasingly sort of aware of that. But that's very much the case, right? And so I think Google has released a ton of really important integrations and other features into GA4 thus far this year. That's going to continue apace. But it does mean that, like, when you log into GA4 today, if you come to it with the expectation that you're going to be able to do, absolutely everything that you're used to being able to do in GA3, you're likely to have a little bit of a rude surprise. So, like I said, I do think people are increasingly aware of that, and seeing sort of the ongoing development of GA4 as having implications for when they're likely to fully offboard from GA3. But yeah, I think that's a big one. And then much more tactically, and Andrew, I'm curious if you're seeing this kind of on your side as well, but much more in the weeds. We do get a lot of questions around like terminology and like, why did this change from X to Y, and what does that mean? Oh, actually, it's just a very superficial change. Nothing really happened beneath the surface. There's a lot of that stuff that always happens with any kind of software upgrade, right? So we do spend a lot of time like stepping clients through like, hey, don't worry, actually, this isn't nearly as different as maybe it seems at first. But Andrew, are you getting kind of similar questions and concerns from your clients?
Yeah, exactly. Sort of like, what's different? How do we approach sort of an existing use case in this new tool or upgraded tool? One of the things I think was most interesting, again, sort of reading the Google material and seeing what they're promising is, this idea that we're going to have an improved attribution, and you're like, well, given sort of the privacy regulations, how are they going to actually achieve that? So really trying to deep dive, and I think we'll hopefully get to that a little bit later, but really trying to deep dive into, how Google envisions a use case like attribution, which is, how do we take all of the media that we have in the digital space and ultimately, use that information and attribute it to, our conversion events that we're tracking on our site. So Google promises this improved attribution, but as Nick said, it's this ever evolving process and product to see ultimately how successful they'll be with that in sort of this new regulatory paradigm. The other thing that I think is quite interesting, and I don't know if this is a huge shift from what GA3 was able to provide, but this ability to measure using your own identifiers, right? If you've built out your own private identity graph and you want to take your customers and your customer 360 and use that as a part of the measurement approach within analytics, GA4 is going to let you do that. Again, how successful that is going to be, I think there's still a lot to be learned there. But ultimately, as we see our clients build up their own first party identity graph, I think they want to find places to leverage that information, leverage that data. So, I'm hopeful that GA4 really provides an avenue for us to do that and ultimately use the disparate sources of information and data that we have and use that to form a whether it be attribution or whatever use case we're trying to go after, use that data to ultimately improve upon that process.
Seems like good timing for that to be a feature that GA4 allows for, given, upcoming third-party cookie deprecation on Chrome.
Which that's actually kind of bringing up another question that I've been thinking of. And like, outside of just how to prepare, what are some other technical changes that are a result of this migration? What can marketers expect out of GA4 that's different from historical analytics and Gaia, to your point around like a third-party deprecation? I mean, this isn't necessarily a one-to-one match, but certainly in the privacy vein of Google Analytics 4 no longer storing IP addresses, are there other changes that are being made that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So, Andrea, I wrote a blog about that, actually, that particular change.
Yep.
It's not that they don't use IP addresses. They're still going to use them in sort of their user modeling and everything. But they won't actually let you extract that in sort of a log form anymore. They've got these modeled attributes that they promise will be a great proxy for sort of the old IP address use cases. I think it's called location within the platform. Nick, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. But the basic idea, and this is definitely a theme within GA4, is that we have these hard data points that may or may not be available based off of the cookie preferences, as an example, of a particular user. So the transition to a lot of these, what Google calls modeled attributes, what I'm calling modeled attributes, basically taking and using the data that they do have available. So, for example, folks that have opted into cookies or opted into tracking and on apps, and we've seen this with iOS and what have you. But using the data that they do have available to create sort of the old term might be a lookalike model, but it's a bit more involved than that, right? Google obviously has a whole bunch of data available to them to really make these models sing and really work. This general approach to how do we have these two sort of separate groups, folks that have opted into this tracking and opted into cookies and what have you, and folks that have just not and said, nope, I'm going to use an ad blocker. I'm going to use, I'm going to decline the cookie pop up when that comes up on the website. But really Google's promise to maintain consistency across those two groups, and the way they've really approached that with GA4 is through these modeled attributes. And that even comes down to how Google is now going to think about user tracking and ultimately how they track individuals across the site. And again, with that attribution use case that I mentioned earlier, how they track users. Old version of tracking was really this cookie-based approach, but again, now they're really moving to this modeled behavior approach where we're using the different events from an individual to say, like, person A is different from person B, and really start to differentiate individuals as they interact with our websites and properties.
Like an important distinction to draw now in analytics is you have sort of observable data where you have consent from the user, or you don't even need to get consent for whatever reason, and then you have sort of unobservable data. And what Google Analytics is going to do in platform, as opposed to leaving you to do it like yourself in a data lake or something like that, is they're going to sort of fill in those gaps that are caused by the unobservable data where you can't sort of explicitly record what's going on because of a lack of consent or some other reason. And it's been really interesting to kind of follow the discussion on that. I think the optimist sees that and thinks it's good news, right? Now I don't have these like potholes in my data set, and I can kind of carry on with my use cases more or less on a sort of business as usual basis, whether it's attribution or whether it's optimization or personalization or whatever. The cynic, on the other hand, and I don't know if it's just my LinkedIn feed or who these people are, but the cynic crowd, which I hear a lot from, is sort of saying, well, okay, like maybe that's great that you had this model data, but it's all a black box. We're now just like taking Google's word for it when they say that your conversion rate is X or your bounce rate is Y. And so I think that's sort of a valid point in one sense. Like you are trusting Google to like do the modeling for you, but I think to be fair to Google, it's certainly better than doing nothing. And I also think that their sort of credentials on the sort of AI and ML front are like reasonably strong, right? And so if you're going to trust someone to do that modeling for you, maybe Google's a good horse to bet on, so to speak. But however you feel about that, if you're sort of the more optimistic side or the more cynical side, I think one thing is for sure: this reliance on model data is here to stay, and it's only going to increase, right? So if you're, without wanting to sound harsh, if you're sort of uncomfortable with the model data approach now, I'd say get comfortable with it, basically, because it's just going to become more and more of an issue. Yeah. So I'm grateful for one that GA is baking this into the platform where it just works out of the box, and we're not left to go and like contract complicated solutions sort of outside the platform.
And quite frankly, it's not just site analytics and measurement, right? It is across the board, right? The privacy wave is here to stay, as Nick said.
Right.
This sort of modeled attribute approach, or modeling the known data versus sort of against a set of unknown data is going to be an approach used throughout sort of the marketing landscape. So as Nick says, I think it's here to stay, and certainly there are times to be critical, absolutely. But as Nick said, I think the credentials of a company like Google are quite good when it comes to how are we going to take these large data sets and gain insights and apply sort of the learnings from the known to sort of this unknown bucket.
We will have to take bets to see how soon the AI powering our GA modeled attributes gain sentience. But in terms of like totally get you from hearing that, like if you had to do this by hand or in an external modeling system, like it would be a nightmare. It's black box, but it's kind of like the best we're really going to get. But privacy regulations are probably only going to get more stringent, right? So at least from what we know so far, have we seen any like case studies or official testing results of like, if we are questioning these metrics, like how reliable do we think the modeled attributes are? I don't know if there's like a percentage wise answer or if we really haven't heard anything on that front.
Nick, I'll throw that one back to you, being the GA4
Sure.
expert. But
yeah. I mean, I don't think that it's easy to answer that question, at least yet, in a sense that like, oh, they're 91% accurate. Well, here's what I would say: the best question by far that I've seen about the sort of modeled data is not like, oh, we can't trust Google, or oh, it's a black box. The best question I've seen is, how do you know that the unobserved data isn't like fundamentally different in some way from the observed data? So if you're a brand and you sell t-shirts online, right? What if the people who are using the ad blockers and the privacy safe browsers and all that kind of stuff are just sort of fundamentally different like customer segment from people who don't? Now you're using your observed data to model out the unobserved data. And one of the assumptions underneath that, right, is that that jump can or should be made, right? So I think that's the biggest question, right? Is what if you're actually talking about two very distinct customer segments or audience segments, and what would the implications of that be? I think that's a very interesting and if I can say like slightly unnerving question. So time will tell, I suppose. I think we're a little bit too early in the game to really have a firm point of view on that, but yeah, it's something that I know firsthand many brands are kind of actively keeping their eyes on.
And just sort of zooming out, I think that same sentiment can be said about let's say you're using a mobile measurement partner to really work on sort of mobile and app based attribution, as an example. Lots of work being done in that space from what they call it fingerprinting on that side of the house. Really similar concepts, right? How do we take our observed or known data and ultimately use that to model some unobserved or unknown data? There's been some use cases and case studies, to suggest that is highly representative of the truth, if you will, of from an attribute. Again, sort of using the attribution lens here. But yeah, I think Nick's point is exactly right. And quite frankly, I think you would just on the face of it, assume some difference between those populations. These are folks that are opting into whether it be a privacy safe browser or an ad blocker or declining cookies, right? There's clearly some bias towards not wanting to have those trackers or put cookies on your browser, right? Versus the other group, which I just don't care. I just want to get in there and buy my t-shirt, right? So I think on the face of it, you would make those assumptions, but at the end of the day, how different are they? In that relative difference is ultimately where you'll see success within the essentially modeled attributes, right? So potentially it's going to depend on what line of business you're in. If you're a quick serve restaurant, right? Maybe you have so many folks coming to your website anyway, or in your app anyway, and it doesn't really matter. The difference between those two groups aren't that extreme. Whereas maybe you're in some sort of high tech business line of business, and maybe there's just more awareness around sensitivity, maybe is the right way to say it, around some of these privacy concerns. So I think it's going to really differ client by client as to potentially how successful a modeled attribute might be. But at the end of the day, it's really the best I think Google can do. These things are here to stay, as we've said a number of times already.
I think we've also alluded to this a little bit, but just to make it explicit to our listeners, how are the changes in GA policy for storing personal identifiable information? How's that affecting how marketers are going to need to work to resolve customer identity on their end?
Yeah, we get this question a lot, quite frankly, from our clients in the consulting practice. How are we supposed to navigate sort of this privacy safe world? And it is certainly centralized around your site analytics tool and how you capture and manage data from your digital properties. So I think GA4 and everything we've talked about with the modeled attributes and everything there is you're going to have to take stock of that and ultimately see how your existing processes need to be changed to accommodate these sort of differences. But also other technologies like CDPs. CDPs are really quickly becoming leaders within the digital identity space. Of course, CDPs are not created equal, of course. Lots of different capabilities.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What does CDP stand for?
It's a customer data platform.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
And for anyone not aware of them, can you give a brief overview of like what they functionally provide for a company?
Yeah, in fact, Gaia, that's exactly where I was going. I think not all CDPs are created equal, quite frankly. Yeah. It's an emerging space within sort of the digital platform world. And the term, quite frankly, is thrown out a lot. I just threw it out right there, right? Assuming everybody was on board with me. But quite frankly, folks throw it out all the time to mean, but generally they fall into 3 or 4 sort of capability sets. Sort of this orchestration and activation use case set of use cases. And there's a group of CDPs that do that really well. The digital identity space, which is, how do we take the information that's just available to us in, as somebody's browsing our website and try to make those differentiations between person A, person B, Andrew Stark, and somebody who's unknown, right? How do we sort of navigate all those ideas? An analytics sort of use case where we really want to sort of measure campaign effectiveness and do our attribution and those sorts of use cases. So unfortunately, the word and the phrase CDP or the acronym CDP is thrown around quite often without a real concrete definition of what it means. So I think not all CDPs are created equal when it comes to the digital identity question. And really, there are some leaders in the space, when it comes to CDPs and how do we take that information that is available to us and ultimately form a clearer view of an individual. And that doesn't necessarily mean knowing who that person is, right? It could be an anonymous person, but we are still able to understand how they're interacting with our website and our different digital properties. It could be somebody that's known, somebody who's sort of logged in and raised their hand and said, "Hey, I'm Andrew Stark. I'm going to go put a couple of t-shirts in my shopping cart if we can go back to that business, right?" You really you have a fundamental understanding of who that person is. But when it comes to the digital identity question, I think CDPs are really trying to make their presence known as a tool of choice for marketers in resolving digital identity, or at the very least collecting a set of data that would support that resolution. And lastly, we have a capability that we call digital customer recognition, or DCR, and it's becoming ever more important within our toolkit. DCR is essentially enabled through a series of tags, and these tags can be placed on websites, they can be placed on emails. And as these tags fire, they start collecting information about user sessions, and again, sort of in conjunction with a technology like a CDP, try to resolve that identity in real time. So even if somebody hasn't logged in or if somebody hasn't raised their hand and said, "Hey, this is who I am," maybe there's some underlying fundamental understanding of who that user is, and we may be able to curate an experience around that, right? Personalize a web page or personalize an offer within an email. Those kinds of things are really becoming quite important for clients as we talk to them.
Very cool. Well, as we're kind of wrapping up our episode here, do just want to give a quick plug for both Andrew and Nick's articles that we'll link in the show notes. Definitely worth checking out for more information. But again, as we're wrapping up, are there any other benefits or takeaways that we haven't discussed in transition to GA4 that our listeners should be aware of or thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So we talked at the outset, some of the macro trends that are driving, like why GA4 is happening and why Google is essentially, forcing the migration. And I think, those are important and applicable to everyone. Then you get into sort of the bells and whistles, right, which sort of might be applicable to you or exciting to you and might not be. The good news is, there are a lot of bells and whistles in GA4 and a lot of improvements that are sort of net new to the platform, as opposed to just being like sort of minor iterations on what was already there. we were touching on the notion of identity and identity resolution previously. I think that's an aspect of GA4 that's going surprisingly under the radar. So some of your listeners may have heard about Google Signals. Google Signals is basically, for the first time, Google allowing us all to tap into their identity graph to do identity resolution within the Google Analytics identity space, if you want to call it that. So that still leaves questions about how do you take identity from the Google space and sort of marry it up to your first party data or like your CRM or things like that. But one of the things that I'm excited about is with Google Signals, where it can be used given privacy regulations and that kind of stuff, you should see a total step change in terms of like report accuracy and identity resolution, which has a sort of beneficial kind of halo effect on everything that you're doing with GA, right? So the segments that you define are more accurate. The results that you see when you're activating against those segments should be more efficient and more kind of cost effective. So by tapping into Google Signals, by bringing that identity resolution into the platform, you have just this wide variety of kind of knock-on benefits. And like I said, I think that's something that is surprisingly kind of underreported, in my opinion. I actually don't see a lot of chatter about that, even though I think if I had to pick, it's probably like the single most exciting piece of GA4. So I'm excited about it and certainly singing its praises to clients.
Nick, I wrote about it in my IP address blog, actually, Google Signals and
good. Okay, so it's getting some pub now. All right,
that could really assist in. Yeah. Well, maybe not. Maybe all that, not that much, but. I think Nick said it best. There are a ton of bells and whistles that go along with the rollout. Some of them aren't going to be particularly interesting to maybe a smaller client, but one of our Fortune 500 companies that we work with all the time, you could be interested in some of those features. At the end of the day, right, it's sort of the software cycle. You see this with all sorts of software out there. There's a new version that's going to just provide better service for a lot of different things, including new features, including some of the things we talked about with modeled attributes and what have you. But it's an upgrade. You're going to see performance and other kinds of improvements to the product itself. It's still, as Nick outlined at the start of the call, it's still in development, right? It's still being improved upon even as we speak today. So look for those updates from Google directly. Look to see how they're describing those changes in their changelog. They do a good job of sort of outlining what a new release is going to offer from a features standpoint. So, but yeah, it really sort of follows traditional kinds of software and how you're going to update your iOS operating system on your phone or your Android operating system on your phone. It is in some ways similar to that kind of thing.
Awesome. Well, Nick, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing it with us about the GA4 transition. I know I personally need to make sure that all of our clients are aware and know what's going on, as well as flag for our team and make sure that their clients know as well. But again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This brings us to the end of this episode of Digital Marketing Musings. If you have an idea for an episode for our season, we would love to hear it. Just drop us a note at digitalmarketingmusings@merklelink.com.
And of course, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well as rate and review the show. It helps others find us. And as always, please tell a friend.
This episode was produced by Merkle with sound and video editing by Craig Zagorski. Our team includes copywriting by Annika Schließman, graphic design by Garrett Rubel, website support by Drew Flowerday, and social media and promotion by Gina Astrop and Andrea Ratner.
Be sure to tune in next time. And until then, I'm Andrew McCartney.
And I'm Gaia Reed. Bye.